All right. Well, so our speakers today, as has been said before, but there are new people flooding in, are Bruno Bosteels, who will give a presentation on the crisis and critique of Leninism in Latin America, Marcos del Roio, who will be giving a presentation, Lenin in Brazil, a discontinuous history, and Chris Gilbert, who will be giving a presentation, There is no Leninist theory today without Latin America's revolutionary practice. So those are the presentations. Let me tell you a little more about the speakers. Bruno Bosteels, originally from Belgium, is a professor of Spanish and comparative literature at Columbia University, having also taught at Cornell and Harvard. In the past, he served as the general editor of the prestigious journal Diacritics. Bosteels is best known to the English-speaking world for his work on Latin American literature and culture and his translations of the work of French philosopher Alain Badiou. His books and essays have appeared in a number of languages. His major book titles in English include two volumes that were published by Verso Books, one entitled The Actuality of Communism, the other being Marx and Freud in Latin America, Politics, Psychoanalysis, and Religion in Times of Terror, as well as Badiou and Politics, published by Duke University Press, which is also scheduled to publish his book on Mexican communes. So much for Bruno. We'll get back to him later. Marco del Roio is professor of political science at the Marilia campus of the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. His studies have focused on the political theory of socialism and worker policy, and he has served as director of the Astrahildo Pereira Institute and editor of the journal Novos Rumos, New Directions. Publishing widely in Brazil and beyond, he has done work on the philosophy of Engels and its impact on Lenin, as well as on Lenin's philosophical engagement with Hegel. But he is perhaps best known for his work on the Italian Leninist Antonio Gramsci, which includes two books in English, one published by Brill and Haymarket Books entitled The Prisms of Gramsci, the other published by Palgrave Macmillan entitled Gramsci and the Emancipation of the Subaltern Classes. Finally, Chris Gilbert is a Marxist scholar committed to the revolutionary process in Venezuela, who teaches at the Bolivarian University in Caracas. His recent book, Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal Movement and its Socialist Project, released in 2023 by Monthly Review Press, is an account of the country's old yet new experiment in building a free, diverse, and humanly rich society that is not bound by capitalist exchange value production. He is also co-author with Sira Pascual Marquina of a 2020 study published by Monthly Review entitled Venezuela, the Present as Struggle. He has written extensively for Monthly Review Online, Counterpunch, and similar progressive online outlets. So that is our exciting lineup for today. And now I will turn the program over to Bruno, who will give his presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction. Also, I want to thank Rolando Prats for all the organization and for the invitation to participate here. I will read this in English, and some of the quotations I have also put in the Spanish original. So I hope that in the simultaneous translation this will come out. I apologize in advance for not giving some of the more eloquent quotations from Roque Dalton in the original Spanish. Commemorations always come with a risk inherent in the celebratory mood that tends to set the tone for events of this kind when we remember a major figure from the past based purely on a random coincidence of dates and years on the calendar. To criticize the dead and the deceased certainly would appear to be a form of bad taste and impropriety. And yet, in the case of Lenin, should we not respect the Marxist tradition of the ruthless criticism of everything existing, to which Lenin himself remained faithful until his untimely death exactly 100 years ago? Is the most respectful, if not the only way to pay homage to this figure, not a willingness to work through, time and again, a certain crisis and critique of Leninism? A working through of this kind is what the Salvadoran poet Roque Dalton initiated in 1970 on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth in Un libro rojo para Lenin, a red book for Lenin. As the poet himself explains, toward the middle of his experiment, in response to a skeptical reader who raises his hand to question the slightly ironic tone of the poetic expose of Leninism so far, and I quote, "It is evident that it would be improper to enter a loud controversy inside Lenin's mausoleum, but it is more improper, I believe, to try to turn the entire world into a sacred zone to avoid the living and creative application of the Leninist heritage through enlightening discussion." Besides, the poet adds, "What you identify as a slight buzzing tone or as an ironic distance is simply what someone else already has called the language of critique." First published in 1970 in select fragments in the Cuban journal Casa de las Américas, finished 3 years later, and dedicated to Fidel Castro as the first Latin American Leninist on the 20th anniversary of the Moncada attack, beginning of the actuality of the revolution on our continent. This complete manuscript, in the end, takes the form of a vast collage combining extensive quotations from Lenin, Trotsky, Lukács, Gramsci, Ho Chi Minh, Ernesto Guevara, and Raúl and Fidel Castro, among others, with an original series of militant and playful poems from Dalton's own pen. As he explains, it is about making a poem to Lenin and Leninism for Latin America, which is not a hymn, but rather an attempt at, so to speak, poetic vivification of his revolutionary thought, which is not a song that reaches up to heaven, but rather something that is, among other things, a song, but a song that arises from ideas that serves to put in renewed contact the earth and the human. Even its posthumous publication in 1986 in Nicaragua under the Sandinistas, however, could not lift this book out of the oblivion in which Lenin and Leninism had fallen during the twilight of the Soviet Union, together with the hope for the construction of socialism in Latin America. Could today then perhaps be the right time for a reevaluation of this powerful poem collage? Could Roque Dalton's most politically explicit but also intensely poetic book withstand the test of a contemporary rereading, when from the late Tony Negri to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, calls can be heard to return to Lenin for answers to the question of what is to be done? To these questions, a 34-year-old Roque Dalton forces us to add a prior one, namely, which Lenin or whose Lenin should we turn to? Because in Latin America, he suggests, the polemic over the fundamental problems of the revolution was also a polemic over the nature and function of Leninism. Various antagonistic interpretations of Leninism have managed, on many occasions, he writes, to distance it from its correct Latin American application. And to redress this situation, the Salvadoran poet makes a conscious choice to limit himself to the Lenin for whom the fundamental political problem is the takeover of power. The poem, he says, tries to give a vision of the Lenin of the takeover of power, the creator of Leninism as the realization in history of a Marxist theoretical foresight, to the detriment of other multiple figures such as Lenin the philosopher, Lenin the economic analyst, or Lenin the statesman. In No se nace leninista, Nobody's born a Leninist, the poet summarizes a lesson in systematic Marxism-Leninism that he receives in exchange for the use of his refrigerator from an unnamed Cuban professor in Havana, who, after a brief discussion about the situation in Chile and El Salvador, explains to him the young Lenin's formation in the struggle between the Russian populists with their terrorist tactics and the growing number of Marxists over historical and strategic questions such as the role of the rural or peasant commune, the level of capitalist development in the periphery, and the leading role of the proletariat. In the wooden language of the times, this lesson leads to orthodox conclusions such as the following, and I quote from Dalton's poem. Lenin distinguishes the theoretical historical subject of the revolution, the proletariat as a class, which derives from the mode of production, and its political practical subject, the vanguard, which derives from the social formation, which represents not only the proletariat in itself, dominated economically, politically, and ideologically, but the proletariat for itself, aware of the place it occupies in the production process and its own class interests. Insofar as this awareness does not arise spontaneously from within the economic interests of the working class, we know that the passage from the class in itself to the class for itself requires the party to import this vanguard consciousness into the workers' movement. Dalton thus repeats the classical interpretation of this most infamous of passages from Karl Kautsky, quoted in What is to be Done. And he unabashedly mobilizes his poetic power in defense not only of the armed insurrection as a necessary part of the revolution in Latin America, but also of the need for the iron discipline of a vanguard party. Thus, in the poem Las aspiraciones mínimas y urgentes de un leninista latinoamericano, the minimal and urgent aspirations of a Latin American Leninist, the poet proclaims, "We aspire, but with our actions, not with our noses, for the creation of a revolutionary combat party to direct the broadest masses of the people as vanguard of the working class, whether real or potential." The words "whether real or potential" here refer to the working class and not to the party. The poem El leninismo en marcha por el mundo, Leninism in action throughout the world, on the other hand, invokes Mao Zedong for his role in removing Leninism from the trap of the cities by orienting the revolutionary struggle towards an alliance between peasants and workers. Dalton writes, "This is how Leninism entered the world of colonized and neo-colonized countries, crossing rivers and deserts on the long march to the north, under the relentless rain and snow and sun, like a worker's torch that raised to heaven the flames of the peasant meadow until the sun turns red." In the final instance, Roque Dalton seeks to revitalize Leninism in the name of the actuality of the revolution, a phrase he borrows with a long quotation from Lukács's 1924 booklet, Lenin, A Study in the Unity of His Thought. For, as Lukács added, historical materialism as the conceptual expression of the proletariat struggle for liberation could only be conceived and formulated theoretically when revolution was already on the agenda as a practical reality. By the time Un Libro Rojo para Lenin posthumously sees the light in print as a book in 1986, however, this entire framework for the interpretation of Leninism already has come under attack, including in Latin America. In 1980, during his exile in Puebla in Mexico, for example, the Argentine philosopher, poet, and painter Oscar del Barco, well known for his earlier book, Esencia y Apariencia en el Capital, Essence and Appearance in Capital from 1977, and his later collection of essays, El Otro Marx, The Other Marx from 1983, had already published his Esbozo de una crítica a la teoría y práctica leninistas, sketch for a critique of Leninist theory and practice, in which he attempts to understand the failure and collapse of the Soviet Union by looking for the premise behind this process of bureaucratic degradation in the work and ideas of Lenin. And I quote from the introduction, "Surely nobody among the Bolshevik leaders wished for the failure of the revolution, but that is not the problem. The problem consists in investigating why measures were taken that inevitably led to failure, and what were the ideas that theoretically grounded such measures. That is, to put it in paradoxical terms, what was the theory that founded the failure of socialism?" And this theory, or this premise, corresponds exactly to the articulation of knowledge and social class associated with Lenin, with all its undergirding conceptual opposition between the class in itself and the class for itself, spontaneity and consciousness, practice and theory, or the need to overcome the pseudo-dialectic between economic objectivism and adventurous subjectivism, and so on and so forth. Del Barco writes, "The Leninist idea that the theory of the working class is created and exists marginally to the class, outside the class, generates the Bolshevik, in quotation marks, conception that the party is the repository of the knowledge and duty or deber ser of the class. As a logical consequence of this premise, the principal function of the party will be to penetrate the class with the class consciousness developed by bourgeois intellectuals outside the class. In this way, the party will be the transmission belt in charge of transferring from outside to inside the signs of the proletariat. It will be in charge of transmitting the truth of the class from the place of theory to the place of the proletariat. Hence, the essentially pedagogical and mentoring function of the party with respect to the mass of workers, and even more so with respect to the peasant masses who must be guided or enlightened by those who are in possession of the theory. On the other hand, 10 years after the first publication of Un Libro Rojo para Lenin in 1996, the Mexican militant and political thinker Raquel Gutiérrez Aguilar publishes A Desordenar, por una historia abierta de la lucha social, which we could translate as Disorder Everything for an Open History of Social Struggle, which offers a lucid and probing self-criticism, written the year before in the women's prison of Obrajes in Bolivia, where she was kept without trial on charges of subversive and terrorist activities as a member of the Ejército Guerrillero Tupacatari. Gutiérrez Aguilar, in a way, begins where Roque Dalton left off when he took the finished manuscript of Un Libro Rojo para Lenin with him in 1973 to return clandestinely to his home country of El Salvador, where he would be murdered on May 10th of 1975. A Desordenar thus opens with a painstaking attempt to take stock of heated debates that took place in Mexico among friends, exiled militants, and sympathizers of the struggles for socialism in Central America, especially in the context of internecine strife among the different factions of the revolutionary left in El Salvador. Dalton's model for armed insurrections still accompanies the young Mexican militant when in 1984 she travels south with her then partner in arms, Álvaro García Linera, and joins the Cataristas in Bolivia. In her brooding self-criticisms, jotted down in prison, however, she picks up on the same passage from What is to be Done as the place where the bureaucratization of democratic essentialism can be pinpointed. I quote from her book. In my opinion, Marx's work, which is essentially critical, by discovering the foundations that make up the implied order of the capitalist world, degenerated into an ideology of truth and reason that answered questions such as what is to be done in politics. The bearers of this thought, converted into a doctrine, have then to communicate to the people what to do, how to fight, what the revolution consisted of, and they organized for this by postulating from their own parties orders similar to the current one, but also prescribing as their goal a work of ordering apparently distinct from, but at the same time in reality scandalously similar to the dominant one. This critique of the Leninist conception of the vanguard obviously should be understood at the same time as a self-criticism aimed at the ideas of armed struggle and political violence against the state. I quote from later in the book. If in the transformative aspiration, anti-state violence is chosen as primordial and desirable, and therefore, if one arrives at formulations such as armed struggle is the only way to transform the prevailing regime, one not only falls into the conversions of a means into an organizational end, lacking authentic social emancipatory meaning, but furthermore, it is a fatal supplantation of means for ends, of strategies for methods, of social self-movement that builds freedom for partisan audacities. However, unlike Oscar del Barco, who, as I have tried to show elsewhere, moved on from Marx to Heidegger in a quasi-mystical embrace of not doing and letting be instead of revolutionary practice, Raquel Gutiérrez Aguilar offers herself as somewhat of a pivotal figure between two radically different but equally emancipatory, if not revolutionary models. One, which we might call the Jacobin and Leninist model for the takeover of power by a vanguard minority, and the other, which we might call autonomist or anarcho-communist, but which the author prefers to describe in terms of the popular communitarian production and reproduction of the commons. Thus, what is being written today is not so much Un Libro Rojo para Lenin, but rather a collective work which we might call un libro rojinegro para Lenin, a red and black book for Lenin, the subtitle for which would no longer be The State and Revolution, but rather The State and Insurrection. Now, there's still another way in which Raquel Gutierrez's book constitutes a veritable libro bisagra, as she puts it, that is a pivotal book. This is because in its third edition, in 2014, with a Mexican publishing collective, Pez en el Árbol, A Desordenar is reissued conjointly with the feminist treatise Desandar el Laberinto, Walking Down or Walking Out of the Labyrinth, originally published in Bolivia in 1999 by the intellectual collective that called itself La Comuna. Physically, this means that the book can be flipped and turned, pivoting on its own axis, with the book's spine as a stable hinge to be read in either direction. What this doubling up suggests is that the critique of vanguardism is literally inseparable from a feminist critique of patriarchy. In this sense, A Desordenar can be reinterpreted in light of Desandar el Laberinto as Raquel Gutierrez's version of A Despatriarcar, which we might translate as Depatriarchize Everything, by Maria Galindo for the Bolivian collective Mujeres Creando. And I say this fully aware that I'm speaking on an all-male panel. But as Raquel Gutierrez explains in Desandar el Laberinto, the question of gender and sexuality also opened up a rift within her couple and within their group of comrades in La Comuna, who did not seem ready to take in the urgency of the feminist struggle in the here and now. This breakup of the structure of the couple and the broader rift opened up within the group La Comuna are symptomatic in my eyes of the fate of the left in Latin America since the fall of the Soviet Union, and this too, I believe, is part of the heritage of the crisis and critique of Leninism in Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruno. We'll have an opportunity to discuss and raise questions and ideas about what you've presented after the other speakers have spoken. And I'm looking forward to that discussion very much. And now we will proceed to our next speaker, who is Marco Del Royo. Marcos.
Thank you. I have to say I will talk in Portuguese because my English is not fluent, so is better. And lo mismo no hablaré español porque tenemos el riesgo de que hable en portuñol, ¿no? Una mistura de portugués con español que no está bien lo mismo, ¿no? Entonces hablaré en portugués. Tenho que agradecer muito o convite feito para participar desse importante encontro por Rolando Prates. Agradecer agora a Paulo Blanc, tenho o prazer de conhecê-lo visualmente, né? Assim como manifestar o meu prazer de dividir a mesa com Bruno e Chris nessa ocasião. Bem, no Cone Sul, na Argentina, no Chile, no Uruguai, nós temos exemplos de partidos socialistas antes da Primeira Guerra Mundial. Um primeiro na Argentina, depois um outro em 1896, no Uruguai em 1910, 1912 no Chile. Foram exemplos muito especiais. No Brasil, isso não aconteceu. Quer dizer, as tentativas de formação de partido operário ou de partido socialista não duraram mais do que alguns meses, né? mesmo o nome de Marx no Brasil era muito pouco conhecido, era algo esporádico, frequentemente colocado ao lado de Auguste Comte, de Charles Darwin, não era visto como a imagem que nós temos de um teórico revolucionário fundamental, né? De modo que pode-se afirmar tranquilamente que no Brasil e em grande medida no resto da América Latina, o nome de Marx ou marxismo chegam acoplado ao nome de Lenin. É difícil dizer da existência do marxismo na América Latina que não seja o marxismo e leninismo, né? O marxismo-leninismo. Então, o impacto da Revolução Russa na América Latina, como no resto do mundo, foi muito grande. E o impacto da Revolução Russa, o bolchevismo, o Lenin, figura histórica, e o leninismo chegaram por essas paragens. Agora, chegaram de uma maneira muito fragmentada, muito fragmentada. Quer dizer, se ouvia falar, quer dizer, havia informações pelos jornais conservadores, reacionários, e havia informações pela imprensa operária. O máximo que acontecia, num primeiro momento longo, aliás, é que se via textos de Lenin, fragmentos, passagens, né? E não era, portanto, um autor que se conseguisse estudar. No caso do Brasil, especificamente, no correr dos anos 20, muito pouca coisa foi traduzida de Marx e de Lenin. O que a militância revolucionária tinha acesso era, basicamente, esses fragmentos publicados em jornal, como eu disse. Muito do que se acessava no Brasil era em língua espanhola. Em parte, também em francês. Temos que considerar que o francês era a língua culta. Até os anos 60, pelo menos, no Brasil, o francês era a língua culta. O inglês começa a penetrar, digamos assim, de uma forma mais difusa no Brasil depois dos anos 70. Nas escolas, né, se aprendia francês, não inglês, né? Bem, e a Internacional Comunista insistia que não havia necessidade de fazer publicações em português, porque os brasileiros entendiam espanhol. Isso, em parte, é verdade, né? Mas, se observarmos a educação militante, revolucionária no Brasil, ela, em grande medida, ocorreu por meio da língua espanhola. Por exemplo, a revista do Secretariado Sul-Americano da Internacional Comunista, né? Da Correspondência Internacional, né? Existia, então, em espanhol e existia também a versão em francês. Isso se explica também, em alguma medida, pela forma de se organizar a Internacional Comunista na sua relação com a América Latina. Bem, mesmo a fundação do Partido Comunista Brasileiro, ele deve muitíssimo às relações com o Cone Sul. A Argentina, os argentinos, né, tiveram um papel muito importante no desenvolvimento do Partido Comunista Brasileiro, pelo menos até meados dos anos 30. Na verdade, no tempo que durou a Internacional Comunista, né? Bem, muito bem. Ainda nos anos 20, bem, se falava, obviamente, de Lenin, mas, como eu disse, muito da informação e da formação da militância era advinda da Internacional Comunista. E pouca coisa de Lenin, dos textos de Lenin propriamente ditos, chegavam aqui, né? Agora, do leninismo, conforme ele se configurava como uma ideologia, o marxismo-leninismo, conforme se configurava como uma ideologia da Internacional Comunista e da União Soviética, né? Ele reforçava ou destacava com grande importância alguns elementos desenvolvidos na trajetória do Lenin como teórico e como militante revolucionário, né? Uma essencial é a do Partido Revolucionário. Vou insistir nesses pontos que, na minha avaliação, guardam atualidade. Não por nada estamos aqui lembrando o centenário da morte de Lenin, não como um mero cadáver, mas como alguém que tem atualidade, tem algo ou muito a nos dizer para esse século XXI, nesse momento trágico que nós estamos passando nesses dias, né? Um é do Partido Revolucionário. A outra questão é a questão do imperialismo. Pode-se dizer que a tese do Lenin sobre o imperialismo está ultrapassada ou não, né? Na minha avaliação, ela continua atual. Na América Latina, naquele momento, e do Brasil como parte da América Latina, embora o Brasil sempre tenha se visto, é muito frequente dizer que o Brasil vive de costas para a América Hispânica. Ele olha para o Atlântico, mas vive de costas para a América Hispânica, né? Por muito tempo foi assim, e às vezes volta a ser assim, de acordo com a conjuntura, né? Bem, muito bem. É a questão do imperialismo. Então, a questão do imperialismo e do anti-imperialismo na América Latina é, obviamente, um tema de grande importância e de grande atualidade. Isso já era destacado nos anos 20. Quer dizer, o que se dizia naquela ocasião, olha, nós vivemos num momento em que há uma grande disputa entre o imperialismo inglês, em relativo declínio, e a ascensão do imperialismo dos Estados Unidos, que avança sobre a América Latina, né? Então, essa era a contradição internacional que se destacava. Um outro elemento essencial, fundamental mesmo, da elaboração leninista, e, digamos, é uma novidade na trajetória, isso é inovador, né, no marxismo com Lenin, é a questão do campesinato, a questão da reforma agrária, da questão da aliança operário-camponesa. É evidente que na Segunda Internacional, a trajetória do movimento operário ocidental até a formulação de Lenin, pouquíssima atenção dava à questão agrária, né? Quer dizer, essa é uma novidade. Quer dizer, a estratégia política desenhada por Lenin demandava a aliança do proletariado industrial com o campesinato. Claro, é importante lembrar que a Rússia era extremamente, né, amplamente camponesa. Era decisivo para a Revolução o apoio do campesinato. É óbvio que isso, transferido para a América Latina, quer dizer, na verdade, também para a Ásia e para a África, né, para que nós, hoje em dia, chamamos de periferia, isso é da maior importância e mantém essa importância. É sumamente importante ainda hoje. Claro que é preciso atualizar, discutir como isso é atual hoje, né? Mas, enfim, isso é de grande atualidade. Um outro ponto, que não se tinha tanta clareza, mas na formulação do Lenin é essencial, do meu modo de ver, é a questão da dualidade de poderes. Quer dizer, isso para pensar hoje a revolução na América Latina, isso é fundamental, né? A questão da dualidade de poderes. As estratégias estabelecidas no século XXI, alguns chamaram de socialismo do século XXI, parece ter deixado de lado essa questão. Até por isso não foram tão adiante. Insisto que esse é um ponto, sem dúvida, polêmico, né? Mas na formulação do Lenin não era algo singular, específico da Rússia de 1917, no período da formação dos conselhos dos soviets, né? É uma questão, digamos, teórica, estratégica, estrutural na luta anticapitalista. Muitas formulações foram feitas falando, olha, o avanço do capitalismo, nos anos 70 particularmente, o avanço do capitalismo possibilita que a ampliação da democracia burguesa seja de tal dimensão que, a um certo ponto, nós transpassemos para o socialismo, né? Claro que estou simplificando muito, mas era algo bastante difundido na Europa, em particular, nos anos 70. Bem, a difusão em termos de textos do marxismo no Brasil aumenta significativa nos anos 30. Na verdade, nos 5 primeiros anos dos anos 30. Né? Agora, muito dessa difusão do marxismo, porque já havia uma disputa tremenda, né? Então, já há algumas coisas publicadas de Trotsky, muito de Stalin, mas continuamos com Lenin pouca coisa. Era um pouco mais a disputa interna que havia no movimento comunista que se destacava, né? Em 1935, há um levante da Aliança Nacional Libertadora que fracassa, se estabelece logo em seguida a ditadura de Getúlio Vargas, que se prolonga até 1945. Né? Nesse período, evidentemente, a repressão é muito grande e a difusão de textos é muito restrita. Em 1945, com a democratização, há também a possibilidade de uma maior difusão de textos, né? Há alguns importantes, né? Mas eu tenho uma preciosidade aqui comigo, aliás, tenho várias, né? Esse livro, Os Fundamentos do Leninismo, por Stalin, 1945, né? Editora Calvino. Lembrar que, nesse momento, Stalin era um herói, a União Soviética tinha vencido a guerra, e o processo de, digamos assim, de desqualificação, de denúncias, etc., do nome de Stalin, de outro momento histórico. Nesse momento, ele é tido e havido como um herói. E evidente que um livro como esse é a síntese do leninismo. Não há muito o que discutir, né? Então, o próprio Lenin continua sendo publicado em uma medida pequena. O Partido Comunista, naquele momento, na verdade, desde 44, funda uma editora que sobrevive até 1964. 20 anos de um processo, digamos assim, de relativas liberdades democráticas do país. Essa editora publicou uma quantidade enorme, claro, de livros de autores brasileiros. Jorge Amado, por exemplo, né? Um autor conhecido internacionalmente, um literato, né? Muitos livros de Jorge Amado, mas também muitos livros soviéticos, de história. Até mesmo Lysenko foi publicado, né? Mas, se nós olharmos o nosso Lenin, foi pouco publicado. Há um livro que teve grande destaque, um foi sobre a Aliança Operário-Camponesa, que eu não conheço o livro, provavelmente é uma coletânea, né? E o livro sobre os sindicatos, que seguramente esse livro eu tenho. É sobre o debate de 1920, né? Sobre a questão sindical na Rússia revolucionária, né? Então, mas o Lenin, propriamente dito, não é um autor muito publicado, portanto, não é muito conhecido. Quer dizer, o que acontecia? Muitas publicações que chegavam no Brasil em espanhol. Muita coisa chegava em espanhol. Quer dizer, e é sempre via Argentina. Bem, em 64 temos a ditadura militar, uma nova limitação da publicação de livros marxistas, né? Quer dizer, o drama aumentou com a ditadura na Argentina e a tragédia que acontece com a editora Siglo XXI. Mas, mesmo assim, a Siglo XXI continua alimentando um pouco a literatura no Brasil, mesmo tendo se deslocado para o México, né? Claro que acontecia, circulava muitos textos clandestinamente, alguns de vocês devem saber disso, ter vivido isso, né? Até que chegamos nos anos 70. Os anos 70 ainda é a ditadura militar, mas o número de textos marxistas, quer dizer, aí, de Marx e de Lenin publicados, começa a aparecer numa intensidade maior, né? Começa a aparecer revistas marxistas importantes, temas de ciências humanas. Depois gerou uma editora chamada Livraria e Editora Ciências Humanas, que publicou muita coisa de Lenin. Um exemplo é esse daqui, o Programa Agrário, que é a discussão do Congresso, do quarto Congresso de 1906, onde há discussão sobre a via prussiana. Nesse momento se discute muito como tese a hipótese de o capitalismo no Brasil se desenvolveu ao modo de uma via prussiana. Não era uma novidade completa. Nos anos 60, Nelson Werneck Sodré já havia destacado essa hipótese, né? No Brasil ter se desenvolvido um capitalismo ao modo de uma via prussiana, né? Ainda não se falava tanto em Gramsci, né? Embora já tivesse sido publicado os seus livros ao modo da edição Togliatti, né, dos anos 40, 50. Né? Bom, muito bem. Nos anos 70 e 80, então, há uma diversificação muito grande de publicações, de editoras, de tendências políticas. Há tendências políticas que estão disputando o processo de democratização ou o processo revolucionário no país. Há uma ascensão do movimento operário, culminou na fundação do Partido dos Trabalhadores, né? Um pouco depois da Central Única dos Trabalhadores, que eram coisas muito diferentes do que são hoje, né? Mas no campo das publicações, isso também se diversificou muito. Evidentemente, havia demanda, aparecem editoras com publicações sobre Marx e muita coisa de Lenin, talvez como nunca antes, né? Como nunca antes. Então aparece a editora Ucitec, por exemplo, publica bastante coisa, né? A editora chamada Oficina de Livros, que não durou muito tempo, né? publica também muita coisa, né? Há uma coletânea, né? Os últimos textos do Lenin, né? O Estado, a ditadura do proletariado e o poder soviético, né? Editora Oficina de Livros de Belo Horizonte. Algumas organizações políticas têm as suas próprias editoras e acabam publicando também textos importantes, né? Quer dizer, não só do próprio Lenin, mas do debate que se seguiu na, na, na Internacional Comunista, né? E aparecem, evidentemente já havia aparecido, vertentes que se mantêm acopladas ao nome, à Revolução Russa, ao nome de Lenin, mas depois surgem como vertentes, né? Nesse caudal, que são dos trotskistas e mais tarde dos maoístas. E também aparecem com suas
Comrade,
editoras e publicações.
about 5 or 10 minutes. You
Okay,
need
okay.
to end. Okay.
I'm finishing. Bem, o que acontece? Depois dos anos 90, com o colapso da União Soviética e a chamada crise do marxismo, na verdade, nova crise do marxismo, né? No final do século XIX já se falava disso, né? O que acontece? Em grande medida, o mesmo que acontece, digamos, pela Europa. Quer dizer, há uma depreciação do nome de Lenin, da tradição da Revolução Russa, né? De uma maneira que há uma, como dizer, uma diabolização, né, do nome do Lenin, numa ênfase maior do que aquela que se tentava fazer por meio do pensamento conservador antes, né? Como por aqui não havia estátuas de Lenin, elas não foram derrubadas, né, como aconteceu na Europa, em diversos países, né? Bem, o que acontece? Também as organizações de esquerda se fragilizam muito, ou elas aderem à ordem política e social, né? O exemplo maior do maior partido da esquerda, que era o PT, né? É o PT, que adere completamente à ordem social e ao que nós chamamos de neoliberalismo, né? As organizações que se mantêm, digamos assim, muito próximas ao nome de Lenin são muito frágeis, né? Mas, mesmo assim, há um resgate nos últimos anos no nome de Lenin. E eu acredito que esse centenário vai ser um impulso para que isso aconteça. Do ponto de vista de estudos, né, do pensamento do Lenin. Nos últimos anos, uma editora chamada Boitempo Editorial tem publicado uma coleção de Lenin que tem tido, digamos assim, bastante sucesso editorial, é muito acessada também nas redes. Então, nós podemos ter digamos assim, para uma perspectiva de futuro, um otimismo relativo, né, sobre uma nova difusão e estudos do pensamento do Lenin. E fazer com que, se isso tiver algum sucesso, com que volte a ser um autor estudado nas universidades. Efetivamente, óbvio, né, foi expulso da universidade faz bastante tempo. São pouquíssimos os professores que ministram aulas sobre Lenin, né? Eu creio que eu posso encerrar por aqui esse painel sobre a trajetória do Lenin no Brasil. Claro que foi muito rápido e pode ter deixado muitas dúvidas, mas isso nós podemos deixar, se for o caso, para depois. Obrigado.
Thank you very much, and I am looking forward to the discussion that can engage with some of what you've raised. And finally, we will move on to our final speaker, Chris Gilbert. Chris, are you there?
I am indeed, yeah.
Okay, the floor is yours.
I want to begin thanking the organizers, Paul, Rolando, Martin, and the translators for organizing this event. I think it's interesting and positive that that I believe in my quick survey what's happening in this moment. There's probably more interest in Lenin in the Spanish-speaking world, especially Latin America, than elsewhere. And I guess that I feel like that plays into the thesis that I'll advance shortly. I'm going to read my paper, which isn't my custom, but it's practically a necessity for the translation. So I'll begin. The title of my paper is There is no Leninist theory today without Latin America's revolutionary practice. What I want to do here is talk about Lenin, but I also want to connect it to my ongoing interest in socialist strategy. To begin, I want to show how Lenin is still active in Latin America. Loosely paraphrasing Jose Martí, you could say that Lenin anda por América Latina con las botas puestas desde hace 70 años o más. That's Lenin. Lenin still goes through Latin America with his boots on for the past 70 years. And if I were Mario Tronti, I just wanted to pay homage to his way of writing or way of thinking, I would write a book called Lenin in Macondo or something like that. So what exactly do I understand for Lenin? Here I want to take a page from George Lukács, the young George Lukács, and also quoted by Roque Dalton. And in Lenin, The Unity of His Thought, that's the title of the essay. Lukács says that the essence of Lenin is the actuality of the revolution. So I see Lenin as a kind of operation, a function, if you will, but it's also a time and place. It's the time and place of the revolution, of the actuality of the revolution. When you read Lenin, you'll discover that he has a veritable obsession with time and timing. And the posters and photos, some of which I have in my apartment, you can almost always see a watch chain coming out of his vest. He had a pocket watch, which was the personal timepiece, the only personal timepiece that existed for much of his life. Later in the First World War, the wristwatch became more common. And Lenin was one of the first, or a very early owner of a wristwatch. There's a famous photo of him on a park bench where you can see the wristwatch. It's said that maybe it was a gift from Stalin or from a new Soviet factory. But in general, the obsession with time is most evident in his writing, or most importantly evident in his writing. There you find many words like urgent, immediate, burning. They're present everywhere. And this becomes particularly acute in the summer and fall of 1917. There he wrote texts saying things like, if the revolution doesn't happen at this precise time, X, if it happens days before, days later, hours before, hours later, it will fail. He said 100 times, both in oral and written discourse, a moment more and all is lost. To delay is a crime. So this is the pattern in Lenin's writing. And of course, Lenin was literally right in an important sense. Timing is important, timing was important. However, partly because his obsession with timing, precise timing, contrasted with the reality of the party apparatus that he had, which was quite a bit more tropical, chaotic, and prone to act autonomously than most people admit. And I refer you to Alexander Rabinovich's very interesting work on this subject. I think his obsession with time should be read symptomatically. For that reason, I would say that for Lenin, the real issue is not the quantitative side of time, but the qualitative aspect of it. I think that Lenin sensed that there was a kind of kairos, which is the Greek word for a moment of great possibility, the possibility of great change. And that moment could also be called, the kairos could also be called the actuality of the revolution. To express the notion of kairos in plain street English, one way of saying it would be the sense that the game is on, the revolutionary game is on. And in Latin America is a place, or at least one of the central places, where the revolutionary game has been on for some time. Roque Dalton, in the very text that Bruno mentioned, dates that moment of actuality from 1953, the moment in which the Movimiento 26 de Julio assaulted the Cartel de Moncada. But I would go earlier, as we'll see later on. I would locate it in the very moment, the 1920s, when Lukács was writing. So here I want to talk about Lenin and Venezuela. I want to say that I've experienced that sense that the revolutionary game was on in Venezuela. When I came here in 2006, events were moving very fast. Chavez declared that year that the revolution would be socialist. He declared it before the October elections. And I thought, as everybody thought, this is astounding, given how politicians almost always moderate their programs before the elections. Also, at that time, Consejos Comunales were being formed. We thought they were Soviets. I participated in marches, regular marches of up to half a million people. And people were activated in self-government and self-organization at all levels of society. To quote Che Guevara, I lived this idea that the extraordinary becomes quotidian, and which I think is another way of expressing the kairos, the moment of great opening of time and of great unprecedented possibilities. Because of that, in the community television station called Kacha TV, where I actually lived, our group, we actually used Lenin. This was the group that I militated with and lived with. And we actually lived with Lenin's thought. It was held up. I always think we held it up to reality like this. It was actually superimposed on reality. For example, in the community media station, following Lenin and Jean Jaurès, we thought the community media movement should try to take any event, any quotidian event, and connect its and express its connection to the revolution, which is a Leninist principle. We also tried to use the media to organize people. We thought of the communication organ as a way of organizing people, as Lenin wanted to do with Iskra. And then another example, we were internationalists. We took this quote from Lenin, where Lenin says, the revolution is like two chicks that were born in a single egg. And one was in Russia in Lenin's time, and one was in Germany. We said that the one in Venezuela, there was one in Germany, and there was one in Colombia. And the Venezuelan one had hatched, but the Colombian one was still to hatch, and we were trying to make it hatch. So this very intimate relation we had with Lenin, which I say was like putting Lenin in contact with reality, in close contact with reality, it resulted in some strange juxtapositions. For example, one idea we had was that at that time in 2006, we didn't have a vanguard party, but we said we had Chavez, the person, he was the vanguard. That was what we had instead of the Leninist party. And then there were other things we had. We had a bizarre thesis about the importance of cadres. But in general, I would say that this relation we had with Lenin was a relation that was full of pushes and shoves. It was more like a tango than a waltz or a minuet. And surely some of our ideas about Lenin were mistaken, some of our uses of Lenin. But I think the most important thing, and that's the reason why I go into this digression about my personal experience, is that this use of Lenin shows, I think, that there was a kairos that was there. There was an opening of time, that the game was on. So we turned to Lenin and we used Lenin's thought because, and it was activated in that kind of context, in that context of a revolutionary opening in time. Now I want to turn to the question of strategy. I say the notion of strategy is closely connected to the actuality of revolution. Remember, the unity of his thought, as Lukács says. I want to begin by pointing out how people often misunderstand or underestimate the question of strategy and its importance in Lenin. And they do so in part because they constantly repeat this question, what is to be done, as if that were Lenin's question. In fact, as is well known, Lenin took that title from one of his own and one of his brother's favorite books, the book by the same title by Chernyshevsky. Maybe like someone today, one of us would take a movie title to use as our essay title. However, at the same time, there's a short article dealing with many of the same questions that's titled Where to Begin. And I think that title is a much better and more appropriate title because it points to the issue of strategy. And the same can be said for the nearly contemporary title of an article by Lenin, which is Our Immediate Task. So as I see people go around asking this question, they say, what is to be done? But that's a common sense question, an open-ended question. It's even a question for idiots. It's an excessively general question. The real question is where to begin, what strategy to pursue, because a strategy is how you get from here to there. There's a beginning, a midpoint, various midpoints, and a conclusion. Now, it seems to me that it's fairly obvious that a viable serious strategy will only develop where the revolution is actual. I think this follows from a Marxist understanding of historical materialism. To quote Lukács, curiously the same quote that Bruno pulled out from the unity of the study of his thought, a study of the unity of his thought. I quote Lukács, for historical materialism is the conceptual expression of the proletariat struggle for liberation. For historical materialism as the conceptual expression of the proletariat struggle for liberation could only be conceived and formulated theoretically when the revolution was already on the historical agenda as a practical reality, when, in the misery of the proletariat, in Marx's words, was to be seen not only misery itself, but also the revolutionary element, which will bring down the old order, end of quote. Now, since I believe that Latin America is a place where the actuality of the revolution has existed, that's essentially what I've argued so far, it stands to reason that some of the most creative and relevant, and therefore Leninist strategies for socialist construction will have been conceived there. Take Jose Carlos Mariátegui in the 1920s, the Peruvian revolutionary intellectual. He saw how the Ayllu, the Andean rural community, could serve as a springboard for socialist construction. This was in the face of the dogmatic assumptions of the Third International, which were not viable. And he argued that in these rural communities, there was a practical socialism, a prefiguration of socialism that could be activated. This idea is laid out in the Siete Ensayos sobre la Realidad Peruana, but it's also present in other works of his. Now, I just said a creative and therefore Leninist strategy. Why do I connect the word creative to Leninist strategy? Remember that a contemporary observer, Antonio Gramsci, felt that Lenin's strategy, the Bolshevik strategy, presumably because it was based on campesinos as much as an urban proletariat, was a revolution against capital. It was a creative reactivation of Marxism by putting in dialogue with local realities. And I would also like to add, in addition to local realities, local traditions of struggle. Well, this is exactly what Mariátegui proposed. He realized, and this was his genius, that by putting Marxism in dialogue with local realities, he said famously that socialism would be, in Latin America, would be ni cálculo ni copia, sino creación heroica. That he understood that by putting it in contact with local realities, that wasn't a compromised position. It's not like people imagine that you take Marxism and local reality meet each other. Marxism gives up a little bit, and the local tradition gives up a little bit, and they meet halfway, and voila, you have the compromise. No, it's not a compromise. Rather, conjugating Marxism with the local reality and with the local emancipatory traditions was a way to make Marxism more Marxist. And the converse is also true. It was only by embracing socialism that the local reality and the national traditions could be preserved and respected. In contemporary neoliberal business language, you could say a win-win situation. So I believe, following Gramsci, that Lenin did the same thing. He activated Marxism creatively, in touch with local realities and traditions of struggle. This, despite Lenin's conflicts with the Narodniks, which are expressed in many texts, especially what are the friends of the people and what heritage do we renounce, he adopted what Lars Lee, in his biographical work, calls a heroic scenario that was based on optimistic assumptions about the inspiring power of class leadership. In effect, I say heroic scenario, that comes from the Narodnik viewpoint. In effect, Lenin fused Kautsky's social democratic model with elements of Russia's reality. Lenin is supposed to have said, about referring to his brother's tactics, his populist brother's tactics, we will go another way, Sasha, we'll choose another path. But he never downplayed the Russian populist, the Narodnik's heroism. He also adopted the notion of a historic mission of the Narod, the whole people. That was part of his strategic vision. On the heroism crowd, Lenin said, for example, the miracles of a revolutionary cause that can be brought about not only by the circle, but he referred to these miracles that can be brought about not only by a circle, but by a lone individual. And I think this is a page from Chernyshevsky, or it could be a page from Chernyshevsky, his hero, Rachmatov. So I say this dynamic, this fusion or activation of Marxism via a local reality and tradition has occurred throughout Latin America. If you look at the Cuban Revolution, that revolution has been effective, dynamic, and lasting precisely because of the reactivation through Marxianismo and other local traditions and practices of the struggle. For example, Marti's ethics, or the ongoing search for the higher moral ground, which was typical of Marti, or the legacy of the Mambises. There's many other elements. Conversely, Marxianismo and the endogenous traditions have survived in Cuba precisely because of socialism. So there's a lot to say here about this kind of reactivation. You could refer to the Palenques in Colombia, which are like Maroon communities, and how the FARC's Republic of Maiquetía was in some way reactivated this kind of idea, or the role of the Ejidos in Mexico and their connections with Zapatismo. But now I want to fast forward to Venezuela and talk about Chavez. I continue that Chavez was a kind of unconscious but very consequent Leninist. He developed a creative, I say creative and Leninist strategy. He developed a creative strategy for socialist construction that relied on popular power, both urban and rural, as its motor. And eventually that idea issued into the idea that socialism could be built around the commune, activating local communitarian traditions, just as Mariátegui proposed, and Marx did in his letter to Vera Sassoula. So the idea in Venezuela is to use the commune as a building block of socialism and go forward to hegemonize the whole society, the whole economy, and also abolish the state. I've written extensively about that in my recent book, Commune or Nothing. I think these forms of living Marxism and Leninism, particularly the strategic dimension, are what deserve a lot of attention today, and that's how I want to conclude. So right now, I think there's an interesting, urgent search for a socialist strategy, especially an eco-socialist strategy. In 2022, there was a brilliant article in Spectrum magazine by Jody Dean and Kai Heron, and it's called Climate Leninism and the Socialist Transition. And that article, I thought, was quite eye-opening. They pointed out very convincingly and thoroughly how the question of the socialist transition, and I would say strategy in my own language, that's a kind of blind spot in contemporary socialist thought. The question is always elided and always overlooked. And you can make a diagram of the ways it's overlooked or erased. And one common way is to just focus on post-revolutionary planning. That is, instead of thinking about how to do the revolution, you think about post-revolutionary planning. Another is spontaneism, and the cult to spontaneism goes on. They refer to the end nodes tradition, but there's many people who follow a cult to spontaneism. Another is the fetishization of the small. I think they drew some flack for that. And another is calling, and this is kind of Andres Malm's line, calling for war communism, but really then having no idea of how to get there, how to get to war communism. So that's why they called for a climate Leninism for the socialist transition. And in my own language, I would say they're calling for a turn to Lenin into developing a strategy for the transition. So I think they're right. However, the thing I want to add to that is that I think the world only seems to be short on Leninist projects for the transition. That is, projects of socialist strategy if you fail to consider the global South, which is where the revolution has been most active, most actual, and where there have been Kairos-type situations. I would say there are many Leninist proposals, anti-capitalist strategies with an ecological dimension that are already underway in the global South. And I want to mention just three to conclude. The first one is China and its proposal to make an ecological civilization. That proposal was laid out in Xi Jinping's address to the National People's Congress in 2017. And in it, he called for, quote, the building of an ecological civilization that will benefit generations to come. This is a strategic proposal that deserves careful consideration, respectful consideration. The second one I want to point to is the struggle led by Palestinians against Zionist and imperialist genocidal onslaught. I believe that Hamas, Ansar Allah, the Houthis, and Hezbollah are at the forefront of a struggle against exterminist imperialism. That's an imperialist project of exterminating both people and nature that reaches from the English settler colonial project of colonizing Ireland and extirpating the Irish, passing through the settler colonialist exterminist projects of North America, Australia, and so on. Right now, the heroic struggle of the Palestinian people against Zionism is at the epicenter of resistance against that project. It's an active form of eco-Leninism, though of course it does not go by that name. Thirdly, I want to mention Venezuelans' proposal to build communal socialism. This is a socialist strategy that is based partly on the inputs from Esteban Mesaros, but it also responds to local traditions, and as much as it aims, as I mentioned earlier, to activate communitarian principles developed over the long Dordogne in Venezuela, especially those of indigenous, maroon, and peasant communities. It has enormous ecological potential, and I explore this in a summer essay called, in this volume of Monthly Review, called Where Danger Lies, the Communal Alternative in Venezuela. So those are some of the aspects of the living legacy of Lenin, if that means the creative actualization of Marxism, which I see as the only real Marxism in the world. The rest is just end of history thought, or what I call capitalist sclerosis. But the real creative actualization of Marxism comes from the places where the revolution is actual. And one of those places is America, Latina. So I see that as the place where the Kairos has happened for the last 100 or so years. And that's where the revolution is actual. And that's where we can find living Leninist socialist strategies, eco-socialist strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And in a moment, we can, well, actually, in a moment, the moment starts right now, we will open a discussion of the presentation or related to the presentations that we've just heard. And I want to make a few remarks to kick that off and swing back to what Bruno presented to us. And as he was coming to the end of his presentation, I was struck by what in some ways would be a Leninist question, or a pragmatic question for that matter. What works and what doesn't work to deal with what we have to deal with? It seems to me, from what he was saying and from things that I know, that a vanguardist version of Leninism, and now vanguardist doesn't mean when you talk about workerism that and criticize workerism, it doesn't mean that you don't think workers are important. If you criticize economism, it doesn't mean that you think that economics is not important. When you criticize vanguardism, it doesn't mean that you think that that makes no sense necessarily. But there's a certain approach to that question of the vanguard that's been called vanguardism, and there's a version of Leninism that has been vanguardist. And in the 1960s, there was a guerrillaist FOCO extension of that, the guerrilla warfare overextended, that, as it turned out, it did not work. And that's part of what the criticisms involved in at the end of Bruno's presentation. But one can pose and must pose the question, in what ways were these conceptions consistent with what Lenin actually thought and said and did? We're facing a situation in which capitalism and imperialism are still oppressively and destructively here. And an oppressed and exploited laboring majority on our planet is still here. And most of us are part of that majority, one way or another. So the what is to be done question is still alive, pushing up against these other questions of what will it work and so forth, and what about this, what about that? Are there other pathways from Lenin, aside from the one that was being rejected by the two comrades that Bruno was quoting from at the end of his presentation? Are there other pathways from Lenin that can work? Other pathways other than the guerrillaist pathway that can work, that can help us do what must be done? And I think the answer is yes. Are there different aspects of the Latin American experience that help to highlight such pathways? And I think that the answer is yes. And our other two speakers focused on trying to identify or suggest such pathways. Now, one is related to the Brazilian engagement with Leninism. The other is related to the Bolivarian revolution initiated by Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Here, too, it is worth posing the question, in what way are these consistent with what Lenin actually himself thought and said and did? It's a worthwhile question. Doesn't mean that settles it and that it's determined, whether, well, if Lenin said it, it must be so. Maybe not. But when we're talking about Leninism, it's worth doing that work of seeing, well, where's the consistency and where might there be an inconsistency? And sometimes the inconsistency can be fruitful. Even more important is the question, the pathways that are being suggested, will they work in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Latin America, and beyond? And none of these questions answer themselves. The answers are not self-evident. Our discussion of and wrestling with the questions is an essential part of the revolutionary process of working our way towards answers, which hopefully that process will be advanced here and now in the discussion that is now going to open up. So I look forward to that discussion. And that's what we're going to turn to now. And there may be a little complication in how we're posing the questions, finding the questions, but we'll do the best we can. So the question is now open. And some of the questions are in English and some are in Spanish. And so I'm dependent on my Spanish-speaking comrades to now help identify some of those that might be in Spanish. One in English, let's see, comment on Chris's talk. The notion of game can get Marxism into some problematic intellectual waters. Game theory, structuralism, cybernetics, discourse theory, simultaneous simulationism, etc. These can foreclose politics for example, globalization, multiculturalism, social justice politics. All right, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but it might give Chris something to sink his teeth into, and perhaps we can start with his response to that.
Well, I can only say to the questioner, which I think is more of a comment than a question, that I completely agree. I completely agree that I couldn't find a notion of Marxism that's more. There's, of course, many people turn to game theory. Game theory can, of course, be used interestingly in many contexts, but an excess of the very things you refer to, simulationism, cybernetics, I think nothing could be more foreign than my notion of Marxism and the way I want to use Marxism. And so in that spirit, I mean, I just used the metaphor that, like, the idea, I thought was thinking of a way to express the notion of kairos, or the feeling of the kairos, or the moment of opportunity, or the jet set that Benjamin talks about. I was saying the game is on. It says experience that the game is on, you know, when people shoot the clock towers and everything is everything is different from the normal, and the extraordinary things become quotidian. So I completely agree with the commentary.
Let me insert myself for another moment. I had meant to offer the opportunity for Bruno and Marcos and Chris to respond to the brief remarks that I made, and also to respond to each other. So as we're waiting for more people to pose questions, perhaps we could start off with a little interaction along those lines. Why don't we just run through Bruno and Marcos and Chris again on that?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I just want to say two things to your question, right? Like what works and to what extent this, what is being criticized in some of these opinions, to what extent is that consistent with what Lenin thought and did? I think that the first question very often is sort of answered with through the displacement onto the second, which is, instead of arguing, or talking about what works, the question then is, what did Lenin actually say? And I think that argument about what Lenin actually said, as I tried to sort of discuss with a brief summary of just 3 moments in this reception of Lenin, whatever is the attributed opinion that is found in Lenin, that itself changes. So I couldn't agree more with Chris's view of what might count as a Leninist strategy. But for me, it's less important to what extent that's consistent with some kind of an imaginary Lenin, which is always kind of a fleeting object, right? And the way that is a fleeting object is itself a reflection of the local conditions in which these ideas are sort of mobilized. And so it's not a question of trying to find the correct reading, or what Roque Dalton calls the correct application of Leninism in Latin America, but making strategic choices, which in his case were different than the choices that somebody like Raquel Gutierrez makes. And what was implicit in my final remarks about her sort of split from the group La Comuna in Bolivia, and that split in itself, both personal but also structural, I think is kind of symptomatic of where we are at today. But implicit in that was that the outcome of the sort of the path to follow from these criticisms is very much aligned with what Chris was presenting in his own talk. So for me, there's a continuum between the more critical remarks that I presented here and what Chris was proposing in terms of kind of an understanding of socialism based on communal politics, more so than duality of powers that Marcos mentioned. And so I've also worked on this whole question in the context of Mexico, very similar to what Chris and Gio Chicariello Maher do with the commune in Venezuela. And I sort of, that's the path of what works or what could work, particularly in Latin America.
Marcos, would you like to jump in here?
Bem, primeiro ponto, eu creio ser fundamental o estudo das obras, dos textos do Lenin e ver o que ele disse, o que ele efetivamente disse. Isso vale para outros autores, claro, né? Agora, em relação à questão do leninismo, em particular do leninismo na América Latina, que é a nossa preocupação maior aqui hoje, trata-se de um problema que Gramsci chamaria de tradução. Como traduzir Lenin para a América Latina? Não se trata de observar um modelo, não é isso. O traduzir a tradução nunca é literal. Não se traduz um Shakespeare do inglês para o francês de uma maneira literal. É impossível isso, né? Então, há uma adaptação, uma adequação à nova realidade. O que o Gramsci tentou fazer foi traduzir Lenin para as condições da Itália. As condições da Aliança Operário-Camponesa na Rússia eram uma, na Itália era uma outra. Quer dizer, cabe a nós, quer dizer, o esforço de traduzir Lenin para a América Latina. Claro, guardando bem que a América Latina é uma região enorme e muito diversificada. Então, tratar-se-ia de de traduções. É evidente que traduzir Lenin para o Brasil é diferente de traduzir Lenin para o México ou para o Peru, né? A importância na América Latina das culturas indígenas é muito grande. Mariátegui, que foi lembrado aqui hoje, tem um insight importantíssimo sobre isso. Isso tentou-se utilizar na Bolívia mais recentemente, né? É importante que as culturas indígenas podem ser um embrião de alguma forma de socialismo na América Latina. Essa é uma experiência importante a ser travada, né? Continuando aqui na argumentação estimulada pelo Paul, sem dúvida a existência do imperialismo é um elemento crucial na América Latina. As interferências dos Estados Unidos nos países da América Latina, quer dizer, nas suas tentativas de evitar qualquer experiência de transformação social, são patentes e corriqueiras, né? Então, isso devemos ter muito claro isso. Quer dizer, o poder imperial dos Estados Unidos é o maior inimigo da humanidade hoje, não só da América Latina, né? Continua sendo, né? E me parece que cada vez mais perigoso, né? A questão do armamentismo, da utilização de armas cada vez mais destrutivas, é algo muito perigoso. O exemplo, a experiência do bolivarianismo, no Brasil teve uma difusão assim, de simpatia, mas a formação social brasileira é muito diferente daquelas que cobrem a área andina. Estou esticando a área andina até a Venezuela, né? Então, essa tradução de Lenin é diferente para cada um desses lugares, né? É interessante dizer, para eu não me alongar demais, no Brasil, hoje, nos estudos marxistas, há muito interesse, na verdade, sobre Marx, o próprio Marx, mas muito Lukács e Gramsci. Há muito, os intelectuais, digamos assim, militantes envolvidos têm muita dedicação aos estudos desses autores. Lembrar disso, porque também o Cris também citou o Lukács mais de uma ocasião aqui. Acho que eu já falei demais pelo momento, Rolando e Paulo.
The question, I mean, Paul, you mentioned the question of like what works, and I guess for me, what works is, I remember reminded of the fact that in that very book that Marcos showed, The Fundamentals of Leninism by Stalin, Stalin said that Lenin was influenced by American pragmatism. I always found that to be one of the more exotic ideas. That I find it more exotic than useful and interesting. I actually think, as you might imagine from my way of thinking, and in fact, let me go back a bit to, it's an interesting kind of complementarity or disencuentro with what Bruno said, because I start with a very different Lenin. It's a very different Lenin from what Raquel Gutierrez is criticizing. As I pointed out, I actually believe like the true Leninism in Latin America begins with Mariátegui. And then my references are from, when I start to launch this idea of Lenin, I appeal to Gramsci and I appeal to Lukács, basically contemporary figures. So I'm jumping over about the 40, 50 years that are the very stuff that Raquel Gutierrez suffered under. And I try to develop a more creative Lenin. And in that spirit about what works, I actually think, contrary to what Stalin thought, I think that Lenin was a person who took extraordinary risks and used creative, almost surreal strategies at some point, far outside of the box of what's employed now. In that sense, I'm quite interested in the notion of risk, and even Lucien Goldman's recovering of Pascal's wager, things like that in socialism. I think, imagine how risky the Salto de Moncada was. In fact, it failed. Imagine how risky the Cuatro de Febrero was for Chavez. In fact, it failed. I think that one of the problems with mainstream leftist parties is that they're unwilling to take risks. And I think the notion of the risk is important. I think often a good socialist strategy is one that has a 20% chance of success, 30% chance of success. And in fact, the notion of Pascal's wager right now is quite relevant to socialism, because we are doomed if we don't construct socialism and communism. We are doomed for the environmental question, possibly the nuclear question, if we don't construct socialism or communism. I also wanted to pick up on something, and I think it was important that Marcos put the imperialist question on the table. I think that obviously Lenin's whole thought is traversed by imperialism. In fact, I'd like to recommend an essay by Nestor Cohen. It was published in various forms. This is in Venezuela, but there's also a classical version. And Nestor Cohen, this brilliant Argentinian intellectual, tries to show how imperialism really runs from the beginning of Lenin's thought. I think that also connects, I want to pull that in my direction and say, yes, imperialism, because it's only confronting imperialism that you have a viable socialist strategy. So I do think that that Lenin, so I think you can connect this idea that I was saying, that the confrontation with imperialism, precisely which occurs most evidently, explicitly in the global South, and right now is happening most explicitly in the global South in places like Gaza, that is where you'll see strategies, viable socialist strategies emerge. And one of my main things I return to is, in my thought, is to try to see things from the perspective of the global South. I find that many brilliant intellectuals in the global North start from the wrong position. That's why, in some sense, I think that as much as I do admire immensely Kai Heron and Jody Dean's essay about looking for an eco-Leninism. But in some sense, their idea is from the North, we reach out to the global South. No, I think it's the other way around. The struggle's happening in the global South, and the role of people in the global North is to be the vanguard, as people were during the Vietnam War. They should armar lío in the global North in support of Gaza, just as they did armar lío supporting Vietnam. So that's where I say the Kairos happens in the global South. The vanguard, the Leninist strategic proposal, which is also an anti-imperialist proposal, emerges in the global South. And a lot of the other things are beginning with the wrong moves and then trying to correct the better things in the global North, then try to correct and attempt to do damage control. But they've started from they have the wrong starting point a lot of the time.
What is actually in crisis, Bruno? Leninism as a corpus that is outdated, as a theoretical corpus, a repository of historical images, a metaphor, or our ability, which is not only subjective, it's also objective to translate that corpus into concrete practices, whether they call themselves Leninists or not. That's the question.
Yeah, I would quickly answer that. Your point that Marxism was already in crisis in 1917, or even Roque-Dalton's a quick reconstruction of the debates that Chris Gilbert also mentioned between the Narodniki and sort of the Marxists, and even the passage of many from one camp into the other, precisely around the conversation with Zasulich. All those moments kind of signal that there is a crisis and critique that's internal to Marxism and to Leninism. And so I was not treating Leninism as a finite block of thoughts and principles that would somehow at a particular moment enter into crisis, but rather by working through the gaps and contradictions within this tradition, which is inherent to that tradition's own sort of continued relevance. These authors from the 1970s to the 1990s are actually performing, the internal critique and crisis that is Leninism. And that therefore, this is why I think it's more productive to work through those moments rather than trying to reconstruct let's sort of the correct reading. I mean, I definitely appreciate, like Lars Lees, for example, rejection of the classical interpretation of the importation of class consciousness from the outside, which is very much what somebody like Oscar del Barco attacks. So you could say textually, this is mistaken. This is a wrong reading of Lenin. This is a complete misunderstanding. But the point is not so much to then say, what is the correct reading or what did Lenin truly say? But we can also not ignore the fact that these takes on the texts and their relevance in the particular moments in which they were read and reread did happen. And so they are part of the real that is thought through these Leninist concepts. And so the different emphases that are placed on certain texts or the different strategic choices, even in the canonical references within the broader tradition of Marxism, those choices and strategies themselves make up the internal critical potential of this tradition. And I'm much more interested in retracing that potential.
Thank you, Bruno. That answered my questions very well. Thank you.
Rolando, I want to pose a question that's in the chat. I want to make sure I get the comrade's name, the pronunciation of the comrade's name correct. And I have an initial response, and the other speakers may have a response, which is, where are the women among Leninists? And this is from Anesla. Is that
Anaisla?
Okay. And that's a wonderful question. And so I'll give a few names that are worth looking at. And so the initial names have been ignored to a very large extent. They're just being recovered in some cases, and their work is being translated more widely. But Clara Zetkin, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Alexandra Kollontai, Larissa Reisner, and I'm sure that there are other comrades who can be found who are women among the Leninists of that time. I would add Rosa Luxemburg certainly didn't consider herself a Leninist, but she and Lenin were very much in disagreement on a lot of things, but very much in agreement on a lot of things. They were comrades. They were revolutionary comrades. And I see Luxemburg as largely in the same ballpark. In terms of contemporary, women among the Leninists, there are two friends that I can think of right off the bat, but I know that there are others. But one is Jodi Dean, of course, and the other is Helen Scott, who's been, she and I have been working together on Rosa Luxemburg material. But she is also one of the women among the Leninists, and there are many. And one of the things I think which may be consistent with what some of the other speakers have said is the word Leninist can be tricky. It can mean all kinds of things. It can mean opposite things. The question is, what are you actually in favor of, and is it consistent with what Lenin was in favor of, and does that make sense in the here and now, and can that be translated into something that makes sense in our various realities on this planet? But in any event, there are women as well as male comrades who we can find in that ballpark. There
Thank
may
you,
be-
Paul.
I wanted to
Gilbert?
add
Go ahead,
maybe
please.
something, since I did, mention sort of briefly with a sort of self-critical note to the fact that this is also an all-male panel, and that might be what the question was referring to.
Yeah.
But I do think this, the sort of the flip side of this, the fact that this book, can sort of be turned upside down, and then the question is, what's the connection between a feminist critique of the role of gender and sexuality within sort of the class struggle, and how does that relate to the the interrogation of the legacy in a form of self-criticism of Raquel's passage through the debates on Central America and Civil War, and then the struggle in Bolivia. But I also wanted to quote from Roque Dalton, because this is not absent from Roque Dalton's Libro Rojo para Lenin, right? So he quotes among the many long quotations from Lenin, sin incorporar a las mujeres al cumplimiento de las funciones públicas, al servicio en la milicia y en la vida pública, sin arrancar a las mujeres de la atmósfera embrutecedora de la casa y de la cocina, es imposible asegurar la verdadera libertad, es imposible incluso construir la democracia sin hablar ya del socialismo. So without incorporating women into the fulfilling of public functions and in the service within the armed self-defense and public life, without tearing them away from the idiotizing atmosphere of the home and the kitchen, it is impossible to assure true liberty. It is impossible even to construct democracy, let alone socialism. So while somebody like Oscar del Barco does not pay attention to this, it was certainly not lost on Roque Dalton.
Yeah. Marcos and Chris, do you want to add anything to this point?
Muito rapidamente. Além dessa passagem decisiva lida pelo Bruno, é importante marcar que na Revolução Russa foi o primeiro país a dar cidadania plena às mulheres. É verdade que a Nova Zelândia já havia concedido direito de voto às mulheres, né? Antes, mas a cidadania plena para as mulheres, o direito de divórcio foi concedido pela Revolução Russa. Então, a condição, pelo menos em tese, das mulheres, no ponto de vista da emancipação feminina, foi da maior importância. Claro, a realidade social no correr dos anos 20, em particular depois da Guerra Civil, era uma tragédia completa. Na verdade, houve na Rússia uma difusão, por conta da miséria gerada pela destruição da guerra, uma difusão muito grande da prostituição, por conta de crianças órfãs, o desnível entre o número de homens e de mulheres na história da União Soviética é um elemento muito importante para se compreender todo o processo social. Ademais, chegando para a questão anterior, só é possível entender a União Soviética, quer dizer, e a trajetória do Lenin nesse percurso, se nós entendemos a história social da União Soviética. Nós não podemos nos ater exclusivamente a uma história ideológica, né? Da história social da União Soviética é uma história de uma sequência de tragédias muito significativas, né? De conflitos sociais internos, da guerra externa, particularmente a Segunda Guerra Mundial, que criou ou explicam muitos desequilíbrios na trajetória da União Soviética e que culminam com a sua dissolução trágica na virada dos anos 80, 90 do século XX. Né?
Thank you,
Chris.
Marcos.
Oh, sorry, I missed I disappeared for a while. There's a storm
Yes,
here.
you did.
The internet went out. But I think the question was about women and Leninism. I guess one thing I want to say is that I think the question came up about LGBT causes too in an earlier panel. And I would have to say from the start that Lenin would have been completely supportive of the LGBT cause freedoms, and just as he was a feminist, a consequent feminist. Now, and I think that's integral to his notion of the revolution. The revolution means complete emancipation. It's not to be something to be delayed to some post-revolutionary situation. I don't think that's true Leninism. It's true that Lenin had, I remember some debates that he had with Kollontai in which I believe Lenin was actually wrong, but I think he prefaced it by saying, maybe I've become an old man. So maybe he offered the self-criticism before he prefaced some of his remarks to Kollontai, in which I believe Lenin was wrong. So that's the only thing I wanted to say. I think that, and I started to read in preparation for this panel, though I didn't finish it, the Raquel Gutierrez book, and I completely sympathize with I've lived this thing in which women get cut out of, and this experience of, and how machismo ends up being a hamstring in organizations. Essentially, one of the things that happens is that men often, if they have patriarchal power, they're unwilling to cast their lot with the poor. They're unwilling to risk things because they already have a redoubt of power. So patriarchy does contaminate organizations. It's actually, I mean, there's one thing I have to say is I understand how many so-called Leninist organizations have degenerated into highly patriarchal old boys club, to call it that way. And it'd be interesting and relevant to try to chart how that has happened, how they became these crusty organizations that lost this perspective of full emancipation, but I'm not prepared to do that. However, it is indeed tragic.